behind the marble columns and the bronze statues of Sparta. There was a silence that even the clashing of swords could not mask. The city presented itself as the pinnacle of strength, the embodiment of discipline, a place where boys were forged into warriors feared across the ancient world. Foreign travelers who entered its markets saw men in crimson cloaks, women walking with a confidence absent in Athens, and children already hardened by training. To the outsider, it was a city of iron and glory. But within the walls of Spartan homes, a different truth lingered. For the young women of Sparta, the most dreaded moment of their lives was not a battlefield or a plague, but their wedding night, in Athens. A bride's first night was cloaked in rituals of fertility, feasting, and music. In Corinth, marriage was blessed with wine, laughter, and hymns to Aphrodite. In Sparta, there was silence, fear, and the certainty of pain. While Spartan men learned to fear nothing, their brides entered matrimony trembling, knowing that what awaited them was closer to an ambush than a union. This was not the romantic binding of two souls, nor the tender consummation sung about in poetry. It was a ritualized assault on innocence, crafted by a state that placed its hunger for warriors above love, above trust, above the very humanity of its people. The night was not about the woman, it was about the state, about ensuring that her body, her identity, even her terror, were harnessed for a single purpose: the production of soldiers. The records that survive, fragmentary lines from ancient writers, the testimony of horrified foreigners, and the silent evidence left in bones uncovered by archaeologists reveal a truth long concealed beneath myths of Spartan freedom. For centuries, Sparta's women were painted as unique among the Greeks, said to be independent, outspoken, stronger, and freer than their sisters in Athens or Thebes, but under that sheen of empowerment, beneath the praise of foreign historians who saw only what the state wanted them to see, lay a system of control so refined that it reached into the most intimate chamber of life. What happened on those wedding nights was not lovemaking. It was the breaking of a spirit, orchestrated with precision, designed to leave the bride in submission from her very first breath as a wife. And yet, this was not an accident of cruelty, not the whim of a few brutal men. It was a deliberate instrument of governance, woven into the fabric of Spartan society with the same care as their bronze shields. To understand why a wedding could feel like a prison, why young women wept as their hair was cut away, why screams on a bride's first night were treated as proof of success rather than horror, we must peer into the heart of Sparta itself. For behind its marble columns and gleaming statues, there was not a society of equals or partners, but a military machine that demanded sacrifice from every soul it possessed. And it was the women, standing silently in their homes, who bore the heaviest price. The fear that Spartan brides carried into their wedding chambers was not born in a single night. It was the culmination of a lifetime under a state that valued obedience above affection, soldiers above sons, and silence above love. Before we step into those darkened chambers where brides waited alone, we must first step into the society that created them, a society that believed even intimacy could be weaponized for war. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. It feels almost unbelievable that as we uncover these ancient tales together, we are connected across time and space by a shared curiosity about the past. Thank you for being here. To grasp why Sparta turned even marriage into an act of state control, we must step into its core, a society unlike any other in Greece. Athens thrived on debate, Corinth on trade, but Sparta existed for one purpose only: war. Every stone laid in its streets, every law passed, every ritual performed was bent toward producing warriors who would never falter in battle. The Spartans credited their system to a shadowy figure like Lycurgus, the semi-mythical lawgiver of the 7th century BCE. His reforms, whether crafted by one man or gradually imposed over time, carved the city into a living machine. His constitution stripped away the soft edges of life affection, individuality, comfort, and hardened them into iron obedience. The message was clear: the state did not merely guide its citizens, it owned them. From birth, children were examined for strength, the weak were cast aside, abandoned at the foot of Mount Taygetus. While the strong were claimed by the city as raw material for its army, parents were reduced to custodians, not protectors. Their children were not theirs to nurture but the state's to mold. At the age of 7, Boys were torn from their mothers and thrust into the agog, a grueling system of military training where hunger, pain, and fear were companions meant to toughen their spirit. Girls were not spared the gaze of the state. Unlike in Athens, where women were largely confined to the household, Spartan maidens trained publicly. They raced, wrestled, and threw javelins under the sun, to outsiders. This seemed liberating a society where women were strong and visible. But the truth was harsher. Their bodies were honed not for themselves but for what they could produce. Their muscles, their endurance, their very fertility became instruments of the state, sharpened so they could give birth to sturdier sons. Men were forbidden from living with their wives until they reached their 30th year. Instead, they ate, slept, and fought within military barracks. Their prime years of manhood, the years when intimacy might have softened them, when the love of family might have tempered their steel, were denied. The state feared that tenderness might dilute their resolve, and so, until maturity. They belonged not to their wives, not even to themselves, but to Sparta. Foreign observers recoiled at these customs. Persian envoys described Sparta as a place where joy itself seemed outlawed. Egyptian traders found its ceremonies cold, stripped of beauty and human warmth. Where Athens' weddings blossomed with garlands and song, Sparta's were austere declarations breeding contracts sealed by the state's approval. This rigidity was not incidental. In Sparta, affection was viewed as treachery. To love one's spouse too deeply was to risk loyalty to the state. Bonds of family, of desire, even of private joy were distractions that could loosen a warrior's grip on his spear. So, they were severed. It is within this world, this cage of discipline where every soul was harnessed for war, that the wedding night ritual makes its sinister sense. It was not a private act between two people, it was a state weapon, wielded to ensure that even the deepest bonds of intimacy bent under Sparta's iron hand. The chamber where a bride waited was not just her prison, it was the final lesson of a society that sought to claim her body, her children, and even her fear for itself. If men were molded into weapons, women were shaped into the forge that produced them. In Sparta, a woman's worth was not measured by her wit or her soul, but by her womb, its strength, its resilience, its ability to bear children who could grow into soldiers. Their training, though praised by later writers as evidence of freedom, was in truth an instrument of control. Spartan girls ran races, threw discus and javelins, leapt over obstacles not to glorify themselves, but to strengthen the vessel that would one day carry the next generation of warriors. The philosophy was brutally utilitarian. A strong mother produced strong sons. Every bead of sweat shed on the training fields, every muscle torn and rebuilt, was dedicated to the unseen children she was expected to bear. If she felt pride, it was the state's pride. If she grew strong, it was for Sparta's sons, not for her own life, to the Spartan mind. The female body was state property, a resource to be managed, conditioned, and ultimately consumed in childbirth. Marriage under this framework had none of the sanctity found in neighboring lands. In Athens, though women had few legal rights, the marriage bond carried a sense of shared household, of continuity between families. In Persia, marriages were often celebrated as alliances rich in ceremony. Even in Egypt, where women enjoyed surprising freedoms, weddings carried joy, music, and offerings to the gods of love. But in Sparta, the wedding was stripped bare. There was no feasting, no garlands of flowers, no laughter spilling into the streets. To outsiders, it looked less like a union of two people and more like the signing of a grim contract. It was the state announcing its approval of a match not for happiness, but for utility, for the production of children who would fill Spartan ranks, who would one day stand in phalanxes, their shields overlapping, their lives already pledged before they were born. Love was not merely absent, it was dangerous. Affection between husband and wife risked softening the warrior's edge, distracting him from his true devotion to Sparta. Tenderness could be treason, and so it was forbidden, shamed, even punished in subtle ways. To love deeply was to betray the state. To live without love was to serve it more faithfully. What this created was a world where women entered marriage not with anticipation but with resignation. They did not expect companionship, laughter, or comfort. They expected scrutiny, duty, and fear. Their bodies would be tested as relentlessly as men's were in the barracks, though their trial was in childbirth rather than combat. The grave awaited many of them early, their bones now whispering of malnutrition, of torn ligaments from repeated pregnancies, of lives cut short. And so, behind the polished bronze of Spartan helmets and the crimson cloaks that terrified Persia, there were mothers who paid the hidden cost, women who sweated under the sun not for themselves, but for the state, brides who walked into their homes not as partners but as state property. A society that weaponized love itself had ensured that its women lived not as individuals, but as instruments their humanity sacrificed to the insatiable hunger of a war machine. When dusk settled over Sparta and a wedding was announced, there was no festival, no procession of torches winding through the streets, no lyres plucking melodies to honor Aphrodite. Instead, there was an austere silence. Outsiders who happened to witness such ceremonies often described them with unease. Persian emissaries spoke of marriages that resembled military orders more than sacred unions. Egyptian merchants, accustomed to weddings wrapped in music and dance, found Sparta's cold and utilitarian approach disturbing. For the Spartans, marriage was not a celebration. It was a declaration, a statement to the community that the state had sanctioned a particular arrangement, that a woman's body had been assigned to a man deemed fit to continue the bloodline. Love was absent, and its absence was not an accident. To Spartan leaders, affection between husband and wife was not only irrelevant, but dangerous. To love was to shift loyalty from the state toward another person. To find joy in marriage was to risk forgetting that one's ultimate duty was to Sparta. In this world, tenderness was viewed with suspicion. If a man cherished his wife too deeply, would he still march unflinchingly into battle? Ready to leave her behind, if a woman loved her husband, might she not weep too loudly when the state demanded his life for war to prevent such distractions? Affection itself was discouraged, its expression frowned upon, its very existence treated as weakness. Marriage in Athens might have been arranged, but it carried at least the promise of partnership, a joining of families, and some measure of shared affection. In Thebes or Corinth, weddings were bright occasions of civic pride, signaling continuity and communal joy. In contrast, the Spartan wedding was stripped of ornament, emptied of intimacy, hollowed into a tool of governance. This coldness was not confined to the ceremony. It extended into the very bedchamber itself. When a Spartan bride entered her new life, she did not do so with hope of affection, but with fear of what awaited in the dark. Her wedding night was not framed as a consummation but as a submission, a moment when she was taught her true place, not beside her husband, but beneath the state's will. Modern sociologists studying totalitarian regimes have noted the same pattern across history: destroy bonds of love, weaken trust between individuals, and what remains is a population entirely dependent on the state for meaning. In Sparta, this principle extended even to the most sacred and private human relationship, that of marriage. The wedding night became the battlefield where the state ensured dominance began not at the barracks, but in the bed. And so, when we picture the bride, standing silent after a joyless ceremony, we must understand that her silence was not personal, it was political. Her body was no longer hers. Her heart was forbidden from loyalty. Her marriage, from its very first breath, had been emptied of tenderness so it might be filled with obedience. The deeper we step into Sparta's world, the clearer it becomes that nothing was private, not even love, not even the human soul. The state had refined its power not simply by training men for war, but by ensuring that every bond outside of Sparta itself was weakened, controlled, or destroyed. Marriage was the perfect battlefield for this experiment in domination. What happened behind closed doors on a wedding night was not merely tolerated brutality, it was policy. The state designed it, endorsed it, and perpetuated it. The silence of women was not a byproduct, it was the intended outcome. By turning intimacy into violence, Sparta achieved something more insidious than battlefield victories. It created submission within the home, where resistance would otherwise begin. Modern scholars of psychological warfare point out chilling similarities between these ancient practices and the methods of modern totalitarian regimes. In Stalin's Russia, Hitler's Germany, and Mao's China, the same pattern emerges: destroy personal trust, sever bonds of affection, and individuals become isolated, dependent only on the state. The Spartans, centuries before these empires, had already perfected this cruel wisdom. A Spartan woman did not belong to herself. She was never allowed to. From childhood, her body was prepared, her spirit bent, her expectations crushed on her wedding night. She learned finally and irrevocably that even her most private identity was not hers. It belonged to Sparta. She was not a wife, not even truly a mother. She was a resource, a vessel in which the state deposited its will and from which it demanded warriors. The evidence is written not only in words but in bones. Archaeologists studying the remains of Spartan women have uncovered silent testimony to lives lived under relentless strain. Stress fractures in the hips and legs, injuries consistent with repeated childbirth under malnutrition. Many skeletons show signs of arthritis and chronic wear before the age of 30. Far from living longer, healthier lives as their athletic training might suggest, Spartan women often died young, worn down by the very strength the state cultivated in them. Comparisons to other cultures reveal how unique this cruelty was. In Athens, though women had little legal voice, they were shielded from extreme violence by law. Babylonian codes granted wives rights to leave cruel husbands. Egyptians, progressive in many ways, gave women avenues for divorce and property rights. Even Rome, harsh and patriarchal in its own right, placed legal limits on domestic brutality. Sparta stood alone. Here, violence against wives was not condemned, but encouraged. It was written into custom, woven into the fabric of expectation. A husband's dominance was not just permitted, it was demanded. The state itself whispered in his ear, reminding him that his authority must be absolute, his wife's submission total. The weaponization of intimacy was thus complete. Affection was weakness, love was betrayal, violence was order, and the screams that echoed through Spartan nights were not an accident of cruelty, but the music of a system that believed fear was the strongest foundation upon which to build an empire. The terror of a Spartan bride's wedding night was not sudden. It was the endpoint of a long road, carefully paved from childhood. From their earliest years, Spartan girls were taught that their lives did not belong to themselves. Their voices, their bodies, even their pain, were instruments of the state. Unlike Athenian maidens who lived in seclusion, Spartan girls were placed under the public eye. They trained alongside one another, running, wrestling, hurling the javelin, to outsiders. This looked like empowerment. Foreign poets marveled at Spartan women who were bold and unafraid, their bodies muscular, their speech direct, yet the truth was crueler. These displays of strength were not for personal pride, they were rehearsals for obedience. Each drop of sweat, every bruise on their skin, was offered to Sparta preparation for carrying sons who would one day die in its name. But their training did not end on the field, it cut into the soul. From girlhood, rituals drilled into them a single, merciless lesson that suffering in silence was a virtue. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, adolescents were whipped before crowds until their backs split open. They were forbidden to cry out. If they did, they were shamed. If they endured quietly, they were praised. In these public spectacles, pain was transformed into pride, silence into honor. What began as a religious ceremony functioned as state programming. And so the young absorbed the unspoken rule. A Spartan woman was not to protest, she was not to question, she was to bear whatever came, whether the lash, the tearing pain of childbirth, or the dread silence of the bridal chamber with her head unbowed and her lips sealed. By the time she reached her teens, she already knew her destiny. She would not marry for love, she would not live for herself, she would suffer, and her silence would be celebrated as loyalty. Every glance at her parents reminded her that even they could not protect her. Her body was claimed, her future mapped, her fears irrelevant. Thus, when the day came to cut her hair, to strip her of her identity, to shut her in a dark room where terror pressed in from every side, she was not surprised. She had been prepared for it all her life. The lashing at Artemis's altar, the shouts of the crowd, the praise for endurance, these had been rehearsals. Her wedding night would be the performance. The transformation from maiden to bride began not with vows or blessings, but with violence. Days before the ceremony, Spartan girls underwent a ritual that stripped them of the most visible symbol of their femininity, their hair. Ancient sources describe the scene in stark, unsettling detail. A young woman, often trembling, was brought forward, her long locks, cherished in Greek culture as the crown of beauty and fertility, were not carefully trimmed, but hacked away in great uneven swathes. The shearing was so brutal that it sometimes left the scalp bleeding, her tears falling onto the floor beside the curls that moments before had framed her youth. In the wider Greek world, Hair held profound significance. To wear it long was to declare vitality, fertility, and divine favor. Women in Athens oiled and adorned their hair with ribbons and jewels, presenting it as a mark of dignity and allure, even in mourning, when hair was cut as a sign of grief. The act was accompanied by lamentations that recognized its weight for Spartan brides. However, the cutting was not symbolic mourning, it was erasure, a deliberate destruction of identity carried out in silence. This violent act marked the end of girlhood, severing a woman's connection to her own body and beauty. By stripping away her pride, Sparta ensured she entered marriage already humbled, diminished, prepared to see herself no longer as an individual but as raw material for the state. In some accounts, the bride's freshly shorn head was left uncovered, forcing her to walk through the ritual exposed, her vulnerability made public. Others suggest that veils were placed upon them, but not as adornment, rather as shrouds, more reminiscent of funerals than weddings. The message could not have been clearer. In losing her hair, she lost the last remnant of her freedom, her girlhood buried beneath the authority of her husband and the will of Sparta. The pain of the shearing was physical, yes, but its true cruelty was psychological. Every strand that fell to the floor whispered a truth she could not avoid. Her body was no longer hers, her future no longer hers, her very image no longer hers. Some historians argue that this ritual blurred the lines of gender, intentionally making the bride appear less like a woman and more like a boy. In doing so, it further disoriented her sense of self, tearing her away from her identity and confusing her perception of her role. It was a prelude to what would follow: the cross-dressing, the isolation, the assault, each step carefully calculated to dismantle the woman before she even entered her new life. The shearing of hair was not merely preparation for marriage, it was a symbolic death, a ritualized humiliation that told every Spartan bride that she was leaving behind not only her family but her very self. What awaited was not partnership, but ownership, not intimacy, but conquest. And her first lesson was carved not in words, but in the sound of scissors tearing through her hair, the cold air striking her bare scalp, and the knowledge that she had been unmade before she had even been wed. Once her hair had fallen to the ground, the second act of transformation began, one that blurred identity, twisted dignity, and left the bride adrift in her own skin. She was forced into the clothing of a man. But this was not the dignified donning of a warrior's cloak, nor the symbolic sharing of her husband's world. It was humiliation wrapped in fabric. The garments were not chosen to fit, nor to flatter. They were deliberately oversized, rough, and coarse, often hanging from her frame like the rags of a prisoner. Archaeological studies of surviving Spartan textiles reveal fibers spun from harsh, untreated wool abrasive against bare skin, uncomfortable after only minutes of wear. To dress her as a man was not to empower, but to unmake. She was made to look less like a bride, less like a woman, and more like a boy, a body stripped of feminine pride, reduced to a caricature of both sexes, belonging to neither. Some modern interpreters once tried to romanticize this act, claiming it symbolized equality between husband and wife, but the evidence tells another story. The point was not equality, it was disorientation. To strip away every mark of womanhood and replace it with ill-fitting masculinity was to leave the bride in a state of confusion. Disconnected from her own identity, modern psychological research into humiliation rituals from prisoner interrogations to military hazing recognizes this method clearly. Forced cross-dressing is one of the most powerful ways to dismantle selfhood, leaving the victim vulnerable to whatever comes next. Sparta understood this instinctively, centuries before the language of psychology existed. Foreigners who witnessed these customs recoiled. A Persian diplomat in the 5th century BCE wrote with horror of Spartan brides made to resemble young slaves before they were sent to their masters. Egyptian traders, more accustomed to ornate wedding celebrations, remarked that the ritual resembled the stripping of captives before questioning, to outside eyes. The cruelty was unmistakable. But inside Sparta, the logic was seamless: the shorn head, the oversized male tunic, the coarse sandals, all these elements worked together to erase the bride's sense of self before the final ordeal. She was no longer the girl she had been, but neither was she yet a wife. She existed in a void, broken down, humiliated, and primed for domination. The bride's mind, caught between the loss of her femininity and the alien presence of borrowed masculinity, spun into chaos, and this chaos was precisely the point, for when the chamber door closed and the groom arrived, she would no longer know where to anchor her identity. She would already be defeated before the assault even began. After the shearing and the cross-dressing came the most dreadful stage of all isolation. Once the transformation had stripped the bride of her identity, she was led into the bridal chamber, a place that resembled less a sanctuary of love than a cell prepared for torment. These rooms were deliberately bare, the walls, unadorned stone, the floor, cold and unheated even in the bitter winters of the Eurotas Valley. No garlands, no painted vases, no cushions or soft bedding that one might find in Athenian or Corinthian homes. The chamber held only a crude bed frame, hard and unwelcoming, as if mocking the idea of comfort. Worse still was the darkness. The chambers had no windows, their thick walls designed to block out sound and light when the heavy wooden door shut. The bride was sealed in silence, no voices from outside, no flicker of lamplight, no escape for her mind to cling to. It was sensory deprivation, a slow suffocation of the spirit. Ancient medical writers warned of the terrors of prolonged darkness hallucinations, panic, the blurring of reality and nightmare. For a trembling young woman, already broken by ritual humiliation, the isolation was unbearable. Archaeological evidence has made this terror tangible. In some excavated Spartan houses, markings were found along the inner walls of rooms believed to have been used as bridal chambers, deep scratches gouged into the stone, as if left by desperate hands clawing for escape. Fragments of torn fabric discovered in these same spaces suggest that brides sometimes tried to rip off the coarse male garments forced upon them, only to be left even more exposed and vulnerable. These traces speak louder than the silence of ancient texts. They are the fingerprints of fear. The psychological cruelty of this ritual becomes clearer when contrasted with other Greek traditions. In Athens, wedding chambers were decorated with symbols of fertility, images of Eros, garlands of flowers, and sweet perfumes to honor Aphrodite. In Thebes, the chamber was warmed by candles and offerings, but in Sparta, the room was stripped bare, emptied of beauty, turned into a tomb for innocence. Hours passed in suffocating silence. The bride sat alone in garments not her own, her scalp raw from the violent shearing, her hands trembling in the dark. Each heartbeat echoed louder than the last, each moment stretching like an eternity. She knew what was coming. She did not know when, and that uncertainty was the sharpest weapon of all. By the time her groom arrived, she was already broken not by his hands, but by the silence, the shadows, and the crushing weight of fear. The chamber itself had done its work, molding her into submission before the door even opened. While the bride sat trembling in her darkness, the groom was preparing too, but his preparation bore no resemblance to tenderness or anticipation. For decades, he had been conditioned to think of intimacy not as union but as conquest. By the time he reached his 30th year, when Spartan law finally allowed him to marry, he was no longer a youth. He was a hardened warrior, a man who had survived the brutal agog, who had lived with comrades in the barracks, who had been taught to suppress every instinct of gentleness. The state had ensured that his heart was armored as heavily as his chest. From boyhood, he had been trained in psychological warfare exercises that taught him to dominate enemies, to break their will, to see submission as victory. Manuals of Spartan training describe drills in which captives were mocked, humiliated, and forced into obedience. What he practiced in war, he would now bring into the chamber. His bride was not his partner, she was his first conquered territory. Rituals prepared him for this role. Before the night of the wedding, Spartan men gathered in small drinking circles. Wine was mixed with herbs chosen not for pleasure, but for effect mixtures that inflamed aggression and dulled empathy. Songs were sung, not of love, but of battle. The groom shouted war chants alongside his peers, his voice echoing with violence, his body coursing with the same fire that carried him into combat. By the time he rose from this gathering, he was no bridegroom but a soldier again, armed not with spear or shield, but with his body, ready to treat his wife as enemy territory. Some ancient accounts even describe grooms working themselves into frenzied states, slapping their chests, shouting invocations, until their eyes burned with the same fury they carried into war. The imbalance of age was no accident. The groom, in his early 30s, towered over a girl of 16 or 17. He was stronger, heavier, disciplined by years of military training. She was younger, smaller, already weakened by fear and ritual humiliation. This gulf in strength and authority ensured that he would dominate her completely. It was by design a system that removed any possibility of equality and replaced it with submission. And so, when he left the company of his comrades and walked toward the chamber where his bride waited, he did not carry flowers, gifts, or words of comfort. He carried the weight of Sparta's will. His footsteps echoed like those of an invader approaching enemy walls, and as his hand reached for the door, it was not love that drove him forward, it was conquest. The difference in years between Spartan bride and groom was not coincidence. It was architecture carefully built into the very design of the state. While most Greek cities arranged marriages between adolescents of similar age, Sparta engineered a chasm. Brides were often 16, barely beyond childhood. Grooms were in their early 30s. At the height of physical strength, hardened by years of training and war, this gulf created not only a physical imbalance but a psychological one, ensuring the man's dominance was absolute from the very beginning. To understand how deliberate this was, we must look again at the rhythms of Spartan life. From the age of 7 until 30, men lived apart from their families, confined to barracks, immersed in the agog. During these years, intimacy was forbidden. Their attachments were to their brothers in arms, their loyalty to Sparta alone. By the time they were allowed to marry, they were men who had been taught to view affection as weakness, men who knew only the language of control. For the bride, this was devastating. At 16, she was still half-child, her world small, her body untested by life. Whatever resilience she carried had been hammered into her by the state, but she had no experience to match the authority of her husband. Her youth meant pliability, her ignorance, obedience. The imbalance was designed to strip her of any possibility of resistance. Other cultures knew age gaps, but rarely in such calculated form. In Athens, though brides were young, their husbands were often only a few years older. In Egypt, couples sometimes married in adolescence together, growing into adulthood side by side. But in Sparta, the gulf was turned into a weapon, the state ensuring that the groom approached marriage not as an equal partner, but as an unchallenged master. Modern psychology recognizes what the Spartans instinctively exploited: power imbalances magnify trauma. A teenager paired with a seasoned warrior is not a partner, but a captive. The difference in age, experience, and authority compounds the fear, making the younger party far easier to dominate. In Sparta, this was not an unfortunate accident, it was the cornerstone of their system. Thus, when a groom finally entered the bridal chamber, the outcome was predetermined. His bride was not merely outmatched, she was undone before he even touched her. The years had prepared him to conquer, and they had prepared her to yield. The age gap was not simply biology, it was strategy, another weapon in a state arsenal that turned marriage itself into a battlefield. The moment of collision came not with tenderness but with force. When the groom finally approached the chamber, he did not step softly, whispering comfort into the darkness. He entered as he had been trained to enter enemy territory, violently, decisively, leaving no doubt about who commanded the ground. Ancient accounts speak of husbands breaking down doors or forcing their way through windows, shattering the silence with sudden aggression. The symbolism was unmistakable. The chamber was not a sanctuary but a fortress under siege. The bride was not a partner but conquered soil. The same tactics used against cities: shock, violence, intimidation were now applied to the body of a single young woman. The darkness of the chamber amplified the terror. To be startled by the sudden crash of a door, to hear the heavy boots of a soldier advancing in pitch blackness, it was enough to paralyze even the strongest heart. Every element of the ritual reinforced the message: this was no union of equals. This was an invasion. Her screams, if they came, were not hushed or hidden, they were expected. In Spartan streets, the cries of new brides pierced the night air, echoing through neighborhoods like the tolling of a grim bell. And rather than shame, those screams were celebrated proof that the ritual was succeeding, that another woman had been broken, her submission sealed by fear. Foreign observers recoiled at what they heard. A Persian visitor once wrote that the sounds of Spartan wedding nights were like the cries of prisoners under torment. To outsiders, the cruelty was self-evident, yet within Sparta, it was not cruelty at all, but discipline. To Spartan ears, Those cries were not the collapse of a soul, but the foundation of a household where the man reigned unchallenged, and the woman learned in one night that she had no voice. The symbolism could not have been clearer. Just as Sparta conquered its enemies through overwhelming force, so too did the husband conquer his bride. The state's logic was merciless. A warrior who subdued his wife with violence was prepared to subdue any foe. Love was not required, nor even desired. Fear was enough. In that moment, when a man entered his own home as though it were hostile territory, the Spartan marriage revealed its true nature. It was not the beginning of a partnership, but the completion of a conquest. The bride's body became the battlefield, her silence the spoils, her terror the proof that the state's will had triumphed once again. When dawn crept into Sparta after a wedding night, the city returned to its rhythm as if nothing had happened. The warriors marched to the barracks, the elders gathered in council, children trained in the dust. Yet for the new bride, nothing would ever be the same. What began with the shearing of her hair and ended with the violent entry of her husband left wounds far deeper than the body. Some women retreated inward, their voices fading to whispers or disappearing altogether. They learned to move quietly, to serve silently, to exist in the shadow of their husband's authority. Others carried visible marks, bruises that lingered, cuts that ached, but it was the invisible injuries that proved more lasting. Nightmares haunted them, sudden noises made them flinch, their trust shattered before it could ever form. Today we would recognize these signs as post-traumatic stress disorder, but in Sparta, they were seen as proof of obedience. For those who dared resist, who cried too loudly, who spoke bitterly of their treatment, the consequences were brutal. A woman who defied her role risked exile, humiliation, or worse. Sparta had no tolerance for dissent, especially from its women. The message was mercilessly clear: submit, or be destroyed. Marriage itself became a kind of prison. Many couples lived not as partners but as strangers bound by fear. The wife cowered when her husband approached, her body tensing with memories of that first night. Even intimacy after marriage was poisoned, her mind unable to separate her husband's presence from the violence of their beginning. Pregnancy, too, became a source of dread. What should have been a time of anticipation and joy instead brought fear. To carry a child meant to carry another obligation to the state, another life that would be seized at the age of 7 for training, another daughter destined to suffer as she had. For many women, motherhood was not a blessing but a sentence. Yet Sparta did not view this devastation as a flaw. On the contrary, it was the system functioning exactly as intended. A woman stripped of joy, silenced by fear, was a woman who would not rebel. Her brokenness was her usefulness. Her pain was the foundation of her loyalty. Thus, the trauma of a single night bled into a lifetime. It shaped marriages into cold arrangements of dominance and submission, shaped families into units ruled by fear, and shaped the women of Sparta into silent shadows of themselves, behind the clang of bronze shields and the chants of marching warriors. This was the true battlefield, a war fought not with spears, but with silence and scars. For many Spartan women, the weight of their wedding night did not end in that chamber. It followed them into motherhood, twisting what should have been joy into another form of servitude. To carry a child was to carry the will of the state. Her body was no longer her own, and neither would her children be. Pregnancy was not celebrated with songs or gentle care. It was monitored like a military campaign. The strength of her womb was judged by the state's standards, not by her own well-being. Spartan women trained even while pregnant, running, exercising, straining their bodies so the child within would be born strong. To rest, to protect herself, was frowned upon. To collapse was weakness. She was expected to endure, to sacrifice comfort and health for the promise of a sturdier son. And when the child finally came, the cruelty sharpened. If it was a boy, he was hers for only a few short years. At 7, the state would take him away into the agog, stripping him from her arms as ruthlessly as it had stripped her own childhood. She could nurse him, hold him, whisper to him in the dark, but she knew the day would come when he would be gone. Her love was temporary. Her child was never truly hers. If it was a daughter, the burden was no lighter. The girl would inherit her mother's fate, her hair one day cut, her body dressed in coarse men's clothes, her innocence taken in a chamber of silence and fear. Mothers lived with the knowledge that their daughters were walking toward the same abyss. They could not protect them. They could only watch the cycle repeat. Archaeological studies bear witness to the toll this took. Skeletal remains of Spartan women show fractures in the pelvis from repeated difficult births. Many died young, in their 20s or early 30s, their bodies worn down by the very strength Sparta had demanded of them. Malnutrition marks appear in their bones, evidence that even in pregnancy, they were deprived of nourishment for themselves, expected instead to funnel every resource into the children they bore for the state. In most cultures, motherhood softened life. In Athens, even in their restricted roles, women could take pride in raising their sons within the household. In Egypt, mothers were honored with rituals and gifts, but in Sparta, motherhood was chained to grief and inevitability. To give life was to give it away. To nurture a child was to prepare for his departure. To cradle a daughter was to cradle another victim of the same system. Thus, even in the cradle, the shadow of the wedding night lingered. The screams that echoed through Spartan streets on a bride's first night did not end in silence. They lived on in the cries of childbirth, in the laments of separation, in the whispered fears of mothers who knew that nothing born of their bodies would ever truly belong to them. In a society that demanded silence, women found ways to whisper, though they could not openly resist. Spartan wives and mothers built quiet networks of survival, threads of solidarity woven through glances, gestures, and secret words. These bonds were their only refuge in a world where even their own homes felt like prisons. Some of this resistance took spiritual form. Archaeologists have uncovered small household shrines dedicated to goddesses of protection and healing: Artemis, Hestia, even foreign deities whose cults were quietly adopted. Offerings of clay figurines, beads, and fragments of jewelry suggest women prayed for strength, not for themselves, but for endurance against the lives they had been forced into. These objects, often hidden in corners or buried beneath floors, reveal a desperate attempt to preserve some fragment of identity from the state's erasure. Other forms of defiance were more personal. Women carved secret symbols onto combs or jewelry, tiny markings invisible to the men around them but meaningful to one another, in excavated homes. Archaeologists have found personal items concealed in small caches, perhaps hidden away as keepsakes, reminders of girlhood before it was shorn away, of beauty before it was stripped. These little acts of preservation were not rebellion in the open sense, but resistance all the same. And then there were the friendships. Though their lives were shadowed by fear, Spartan women leaned on each other in quiet circles, sharing grief and strength in ways their society could not control. Some of these bonds were born of necessity, helping each other survive childbirth, caring for one another's children while husbands remained in barracks. Others were born of something deeper, the recognition that only another woman could understand the silence they carried. These relationships, though rarely recorded in the official histories written by men, may have been the only warmth many Spartan women ever knew. In a society where intimacy with husbands was poisoned from the beginning, emotional closeness bloomed instead between women. It was here, in whispered conversations behind closed doors, in shared prayers at hidden shrines, in the clasp of a hand during childbirth, that Spartan wives reclaimed fragments of the humanity the state had stripped from them. Though they could not overthrow the system, they carved small spaces where love and compassion survived, and in those spaces, though fragile and secret, lived the last traces of freedom left to them. The echoes of Sparta's wedding night ritual did not end with the women who endured it. They reverberated through their children, seeping into the marrow of the next generation. In homes where fear replaced affection, children grew up learning that violence was normal, that silence was safety, that tenderness was weakness. Sons, watching their mothers shrink before their fathers, absorbed a brutal lesson: authority is exercised through domination, not respect. They saw women's silence not as suffering, but as duty. And they carried this warped understanding of family into their own marriages. By the time they left for the agoge, their view of intimacy had already been shaped by fear. They entered the barracks already conditioned to see cruelty as natural, making the state's indoctrination all the easier. Daughters fared no better. They grew up beside mothers who bore invisible wounds, who whispered prayers at hidden shrines, who prepared them whether knowingly or not for the same fate. Each haircut, each festival where they were taught to endure pain without crying, was a rehearsal for what they knew was coming. Trauma became inheritance, passed like a dowry from one generation to the next. The cumulative effect was corrosive. A society that destroys trust within the household poisons itself from within. When women fear men, when children fear fathers, when families fracture into silence, the bonds that sustain community unravel. While Sparta maintained its military ferocity, it did so at a cost. Behind the walls of discipline, half its population lived in quiet misery, and that misery weakened the very foundations of the state. Historians often speak of Sparta's eventual decline as a result of military defeats, economic stagnation, or shrinking citizen numbers. Yet beneath these surface causes lay something more intimate: the systematic destruction of family bonds. A civilization can survive hardship, even defeat. What it cannot survive is the erosion of trust between its own people. In time, the trauma inflicted in bridal chambers and reinforced in households bled into society at large, leaving Sparta brittle where it believed itself unbreakable. What began as the screams of brides became the silence of generations, and that silence hollowed out Sparta from within. For centuries, Sparta projected an image of strength, discipline, and superiority that bewitched foreign writers. Philosophers in Athens, though enemies, often spoke with grudging admiration of Spartan austerity. Later Roman historians glorified the city as a model of martial virtue, and even in modern times, Sparta has been romanticized as a society of fierce equality, where women walked more freely than anywhere else in Greece. Yet this image was a mask, a carefully maintained illusion that concealed what truly happened behind closed doors. Outsiders saw women who could speak in public, who owned land, who trained their bodies alongside men. They mistook visibility for liberation. They saw athleticism and assumed empowerment. What they did not see, what Sparta made sure they did not see, were the scars hidden under the garments, the whispered prayers at night, the terror etched into the silence of every bride. The myth of Spartan women as free spread easily because it was flattering. Foreigners, especially those fascinated by Sparta's military success, wanted to believe that its women shared in that strength, to acknowledge the truth that their independence was a mirage, that their private lives were soaked in fear would have shattered the Spartan legend. And so, the suffering was ignored, written out of the narrative, buried as deeply as the bones of the women themselves. But fragments of truth still leaked through. Persian envoys wrote in disgust of the strange cruelties they witnessed. Egyptian traders, who saw Spartan brides humiliated before marriage, told of rituals that resembled the breaking of captives. These testimonies, though few, reveal what official accounts concealed: that the system outsiders admired was built on silence, fear, and deliberate cruelty. It is a stark reminder of how history can be shaped not only by what is recorded, but by what is omitted. The Spartan state ensured that its warriors were celebrated, its victories remembered, while its women were silenced, and in that silence, the myth of empowerment thrived. Only now, through archaeology and re-examination of ancient texts, do we begin to see the cracks in that myth and the human suffering that lay beneath its polished surface. The contrast between reputation and reality could not be greater. To the outside world, Sparta was strength incarnate. To the women within it, Sparta was a prison where every smile was a mask and every wedding a battlefield. In the end, the very practices that Sparta believed made it invincible proved to be the seeds of its downfall. By weaponizing marriage, by turning intimacy into conquest and love into silence, the state had created a society of fractured households and broken spirits. The machine that forged warriors had hollowed itself out from within. For the women, the legacy was scars, some etched on their bodies, others carved deep into their minds. Each haircut, each night of isolation, each violent entry into the chamber became part of a collective memory of fear. Their children inherited that fear, raised in households where tenderness was absent, where fathers were strangers, and where mothers lived in quiet dread. For the men, the legacy was distortion. They marched to war with loyalty to Sparta but returned to homes they could never truly inhabit. Conditioned to treat their wives as conquered territory, they were strangers in their own marriages, warriors unable to lay down their weapons even in the sanctuary of the hearth. What should have been bonds of love and trust became chains of dominance and submission. And for Sparta itself, the legacy was decline. The state that silenced its women silenced half its potential. Creativity, resilience, and compassion were crushed under discipline and fear. Population numbers dwindled, the rigid system unable to adapt, the society unable to heal. By the time Rome rose, Sparta was a relic admired for its legend, but broken in truth. Modern survivors of domestic violence would recognize much in the lives of Spartan brides: the isolation, the humiliation, the trauma masked by silence. Their suffering was not an anomaly of the past, but part of a universal pattern proof that when power turns intimacy into a weapon, the damage ripples far beyond the individuals who endure it. It poisons families, communities, and nations. The screams of Spartan brides, echoing through the night streets, were more than cries of pain. They were warnings that a society built on fear cannot endure, that conquest without compassion corrodes the very heart of a people, that love, denied and forbidden, will take its revenge not in rebellion but in decay. Sparta believed it was forging strength. In truth, it was sowing weakness, and long after its warriors had fallen silent. The true story of its women remains a reminder that no civilization, no matter how mighty, can survive if it builds its foundations on the suffering of its own people.